The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there. Welcome to Unravelling, a podcast that looks at the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Kurt White, a psychotherapist and social worker.
And I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist. And if you're listening to this episode on the day that it comes out, it is the new year, the first day of 2025. And we spent a lot of December talking about eating disorders. We got the opportunity to interview Emmeline Clein, the author of Dead Weight and a freelance journalist, as well as Anna Shechtman, the author of The Riddles of the Sphinx, and also a renowned puzzle creator. And that was at the Brattleboro Literary Festival. Also at the Brattleboro Literary Festival was Mary Iellamo, who is joining us as our special guest today. And she was the moderator of a panel between these two authors at the festival. Hi, Mary.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me today.
And perhaps, Mary, you could tell us a little about yourself and who you are and how you came to be moderating that panel.
Absolutely. So I currently work as a postdoctoral psychology fellow at the Brattleboro Retreat, and I spent about 7 years working in the eating disorder treatment environment between inpatient and partial hospitalization and intensive outpatient levels of care. So this has always been a clinical interest and research interest of mine, and I was happy to have the honor of moderating the panel with these two authors.
That's wonderful. What got you interested in eating disorders? 7 years is a long time.
Yes. So initially I had the privilege of joining an inpatient unit as a mental health worker. It was brand new. It was in my community, and I was interested in the field of psychology. And as an undergraduate student, I was very fortunate to earn that position. And then I kind of gradually worked up to become a clinician in that program as well. And so I got to see a lot of different sides, a lot of different facets of that environment. And it kind of just became my world in many ways.
You did such a great job moderating the panel between those two amazing authors. And where did you start with them? What did you want to make sure that you covered?
Well, one of the things that was unique about both of their works is that they really deviated from this kind of stereotypical memoir of the eating disorder experience, which is really, in many ways, unfortunately, glamorizing the illness. And both of them told their stories kind of interwoven throughout so much sociocultural, structural context. And I really wanted to learn more about their motivations for that and how they could engage with each other in those narratives and in the things that they found important to share with the world.
And so today, in this special episode, we're going to take a look back at that moderated panel. As we have a recording of it, we're going to listen to some clips of it and then talk about certain segments of it and sort of help unpack them a little bit for our listeners with your expertise, if that's okay.
That sounds great.
All right, great. We should say the audio is pretty interesting. It was in a church, actually, right? So it might sound a little different than where we were. It's sort of an interesting place to have a literary conference.
Yeah, the authors start by talking about the paradox of connection and competition in recovery.
And I got very, very lucky in treatment. I don't know why, but the women I was with we were all really committed to recovery. Partially that's because we were in an adult unit, which meant we weren't committed there by our parents. We were all there really committed to each other's recoveries, actually. And it was really my first experience of anything like sisterhood. And my first, real crash course in sort of embodied feminist politics, because we were eating 3 meals and 3 snacks together all day and weeping. But I just think right from the first page of your book, you address that kind of, that paradox, right? That we're striving to be special and yet find ourselves in a shared, I don't know, it's hyperbolic, but it's also a common metaphor, a shared cage.
Yeah.
Maybe not hyperbolic, actually.
Yeah, I know a lot of those places get real carceral real fast.
Yeah.
I think everything you just said is so true and intelligent. I think what is Yeah, what's so kind of knotted and difficult to reckon with about the relationships you develop with other people with eating disorders, whether that it's in treatment or in a like unspoken way at a dinner party or whatever it is that, yeah, a lot of times the eating disorder began and it began in this impulse that's like an impulse for not self-betterment, but to be a version that you might already know is not going to be the best version, but is the one you have very quickly noticed in society is going to be the one that gets you the best reception, right? And so you are like, it's this quest for distinction and superiority, but you're using, even before you meet the other people in the ways you just described, you are already in this kind of like ghost sisterhood because you're copying people, whether it's somebody you saw in a tabloid or somebody you saw at the middle school dining table doing something that seemed like a fab idea or like whatever it is. And there's always, this really fascinating kind of tension between the competitive impulse that develops and the really intense sense of care you have for someone else who's going through it, and the way that those can intertwine in a way that you can support someone's recovery because you want to be thinner than them. You can also support someone's recovery out of an impulse to do it alongside them. And you can also, in an earlier stage, be on a message board, helping yourself get sicker whilst you help someone else get sicker out of that same impulse to care. And in all the cases, you're trying to help that person that feels so similar to you have their life be easier, right? And then I think what happens in the treatment centers, and hopefully it sounds amazingly like perhaps not in yours, is that because of the existence of all of that, which the medical establishment recognizes on some level, but in a very reductive manner, there's like tons of policing of the speech that women are having with each other, right? And so there's to the point of the cages, there's like, you've got your diagnostic silos where people are being pitted against each other based on like who has which eating disorder, and you're going to get a very different treatment in the center and like a very different sense of understanding or misunderstanding from your doctors depending on which disease you're diagnosed with, and you're going to be allowed to speak about that disease with certain people in the treatment center in very different ways. Okay. And I think that all of that ends up playing into this notion of female friendship and female solidarity as this potentially very like toxic petri dish of illness, which it can be at some points, but it is also kind of our only way out, right? And I think often in policing the speech for fear of making each other sicker, for fear of triggering each other, it prevents us from getting past that stage into the stage where we can ask ourselves the larger questions of where did we all learn the same tactic? Okay. Where did we all get the same idea? And who's making money off of it? Is it this very treatment center, perhaps?
Yeah.
I think that it's so interesting to consider that juxtaposition of competition, of kind of comparing illness, and then also the solidarity that comes from people who have been through treatment together. And it's definitely something that I witnessed as a care provider in that environment, and wanted to figure out the best way to intervene and offer support that didn't feel alienating to the dynamics and the relationships that these mostly women were developing in that environment. And I think being able to hear a little bit more about their experiences that are quite different in nature really elucidates the difference in experiences that people can have from one setting to another, which, depends on so many variables.
I'm used to working in group settings and doing a lot with group and milieu work, as are you, working in an inpatient unit and having done it for a long time. Are there differences between the ways that sort of group and interpersonal dynamics show up on an eating disorder specific treatment site, for example, than other group or milieu treatment on a general adult unit or in the community?
I would say absolutely. In the eating disorder inpatient environment in particular, illness can be so visible. One of the things that often comes up in the course of severe and enduring eating disorders are a lot of medical complications that arise. As a result of that, there can be very visible signs of illness. Whether someone is receiving some kind of tube feeding or whether there's IV fluids being pushed through someone, there are very visible signs of sickness. And I think that unfortunately that can become a currency for many people in which they will start to compare, like, here I am receiving this, but it's not as much as that person is. Are they better at their eating disorder than I am? Even though there's this underlying motivation to all be supportive and understanding of one another, the dilemma that those two experiences create within the self can be quite challenging. And imagine that in a unit of 15, 20 people all experiencing that same thing. It can be quite intense in a way that, of course, all mental health treatment environments can be quite intense, but it's definitely a unique blend interpersonally.
How can we nurture that solidarity in recovery?
I think one of the things that is so challenging is that recovery ends up replicating a lot of the experiences that people with eating disorders have and that we're supposedly trying to treat. Recovery can be so quantitative in nature. Like, you need to be achieving this much of a weight goal if someone is on a weight restoration plan, or you need to follow this meal plan, and it's quite regimented in nature, and it unfortunately can seem like it's almost pushing somebody further into their eating disordered pathology. I think anything that we can do as a supportive community, as a mental health community, to really try to look at more of the qualitative pieces of this illness. Like, what does this take away from you? How can we build those things back, as opposed to focusing so much on some of these pieces that feel so easily comparative in nature?
Those are more like the meanings of, the sort of context of a whole person's whole life, rather than did they gain or lose an ounce, and what does that mean in that way? So things like that.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I really enjoyed about this panel was the way that they began to discuss this exact issue of the meaning that the sort of symptoms and their own personal histories interwove into, larger systems and contexts. And I think you get a sense of this from both of the authors when they have a back and forth about some of the contradictions and maybe even internal inconsistencies in the way that they were approaching their eating issues, even while in treatment. There's sort of a sense of, being bad in one level and following the rules to an extreme degree, maybe in a different way, but at the same time. Let's listen to them get into that a little bit.
It's a perhaps overdetermined metaphor, but I just saw so much resonance between that and this idea of anorexia is always talked about as a puzzle, as a diagnostic puzzle. And just this sense of I want to be getting the right answers, but in the form of wordplay. There's just something or working really, really hard to do something that's not work. There's just something about spinning your wheels, and finding yourself in a kind of unruly relationship with language, with your body, with others. That just seemed like it all coalesced for me at age 14.
No, completely. And I think the puzzle metaphor and the way you address it is so ingenious because, it's this, all eating disorders are a set of rules you're making for yourself, right? That are cobbled together based on ones you've seen around you or whatever. And everyone has their own individual way of doing it, which again, usually involves symptoms of multiple disorders and doesn't ever fit exactly into the puzzle the way we want it to, right? And so it's this kind of, and the idea of it as a word puzzle too is so essential to ever getting out of it because it's such a project of narrative reinvention, right? It's a whole effort to tell a certain story about yourself. And the reality of our lives is that we can't fit ourselves into a very narrow storyline, right? And yet the treatment so often fails because it's predicated on moving you from one storyline into a different storyline.
Yeah.
And both are already predetermined rather than allowing those moments of fissure and breakage in the linear recovery trajectory that can actually spark a completely new story we haven't heard yet.
Yeah. One more thing. I know you're the question of how linguistic is this? You're actually way more studied in the clinical literature than I am, but I did come across these various, and they're kind of clinical cliches that like the anorexia is trying to speak with her body. And then, words become a dangerous commodity to her, or she won't speak through language, only as a sort of like hysterical symptom or something. And what's always struck me as so wrong about that, even though I'm sure there's a lot of truth in it, is that all of the people with eating disorders I know are so verbal and so smart and are doing the stupidest thing in order to really, truly speak with their body. But in addition to the many paradoxes of this disorder, is that it's not just intelligence and stupidity, which is really there, but also like so articulate, which is something that obviously comes through in your book. And as you speak about it, it's like how to find, I just feel like we're in this very long history, actually, of women who are continually trying to find the words to describe this speechless impulse.
So well said. What struck you hearing that, and what does policing of speech in treatment centers, how does that affect recovery?
I'm glad that you ask about this. I think this is such an important topic to dive into further. One of the things that was quickly instilled in me as a new employee in the eating disorder treatment arena was to police language, to especially monitor language at mealtime. So one of the kind of norms of eating disorder treatment is to do a coached meal, a group meal, a community meal. It goes by various different names. But essentially, it's approximately half an hour to 45 minutes timed of all of the residents of the center eating together. And staff will facilitate essentially a meal coaching experience in which we'll provide individual support for anyone who appears to be struggling, and also policing language. So if there's dialogue that gets initiated with any type of comparison, we're taught to gently redirect, validate that, of course, this is an easy thing, that we fall into talking about this, and what else can we do to focus on a different topic other than food, or other than body, or other than things that I think on the surface we perceive to be triggering, but actually are really are really salient in the experience of an eating disorder. And to police those things, I think kind of exacerbates their danger, or their perceived danger. Like, we can't talk about these things. We can't shine the light on these very things that are driving the eating disorder. And the whole idea of what these authors are saying right now is that, like, so much of their life experience has been silenced and communicating through the body. It's kind of one of the oldest psychoanalytic understandings of eating disorders, back to Freud, back to anorexia hysterica. The idea that women were socially disempowered and were communicating via making their bodies smaller. And I think the social currency of an eating disorder has certainly evolved over time in many different ways. And I think we definitely see that here with these women who are talking about communicating with their bodies to demonstrate their emotional distress. I mean, some of the earliest records of anything even resembling what we currently understand as anorexia nervosa kind of dates back to adolescent and emerging adult women in about the Middle Ages who were experiencing anorexia mirabilis, miraculous lack of appetite, and they were engaging in fasting, dietary restriction, even some records of purging, form of compensation for eating, in an effort to show divinity. And you kind of think about where this was happening: Europe, Middle Ages, women who were incredibly disempowered, but could maybe demonstrate some kind of social value, some kind of worth, really, through restricting themselves and demonstrating their divinity, so to speak. And I think that's clearly evolved over time, where now we see women communicating through their bodies. And it does seem very dangerous and counterintuitive to police that language further, because we as a mental health community may be inadvertently contributing to a greater amount of silencing than is already existing.
I have so many thoughts and reactions to that. That's so very full, you know. I love this idea even just of communicating with the body, which feels like it has a lot of salience, in eating disorders, but also just in the maybe way that we understand how we all communicate with one another, right? It's a much more embodied process than we might imagine it to be, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's interesting. I didn't know that about the Middle Ages. I was in Italy a couple of years ago in Iseo, and they had a little church, a little temple that they had just unearthed. It was like an archaeological thing, and they found that behind the walls there were these frescoes of men who were doing self-flagellation. And it was a sect of folks that did that, and that's sort of my association to it in a way, like this sort of relationship of the body and its importance to the divine, sort of shifted over time. And of course, I guess you would show it with the body if you were being really serious about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But now here, of course, we have sort of messaging in society that we don't talk about in quite the same way, but maybe it's having a similar impact, as the sort of pressure to sort of show the extremes of something for an intense personal purpose, but that's really a social purpose.
I think especially, too, with ease of access to some of this information now, that's why we're seeing even children very young who are now being exposed to some of this content, these things that we value societally for some reason. And there's just, very easily accessible for young people.
And so getting back to language for a minute, it does present certain problems to us, doesn't it? Because, how can we have any way of talking about or having a sort of mutual lexicon for understanding eating disorders that doesn't replicate the very sorts of things that these authors are sort of suggesting was for them such a struggle, such a paradox, such a maybe a problem in many ways.
And both authors actually acknowledged that in the writing of their own memoirs, and Emmeline Clein got into that here.
I think for me, realizing how, this whole I think it felt, realizing how almost impersonal and unoriginal it was really what allowed me to begin a very long process of recovery that didn't for me happen in treatment and happened instead through a lot of self-education and communing with other people. And I think that because so much literature about eating disorders has historically been kind of siloed off into either just a straight memoir, which usually follows this one kind of linear, straightforward trajectory, right? And is often still written with with a bit of pride and can easily be misread as a manual, and itself is just a genre that has allowed a lot of people to get sicker in moments when they wanted to, even as much as it's also offered community and help and care. And on the other hand, you have self-help books, which are often super condescending and are just being sort of you're overvaluing thinness and here's a CBT tactic. I'm sure that'll fix it. And you have medical textbooks that often really, really condescend to people that are suffering from these illnesses and really put them in very, very limiting boxes, right? And sort of medicalize the disease to a degree that ignores all structural considerations. I think my book actually might go a little too, some people think too far on the structural, misogynistic and racist beauty standards and stuff, because eating disorders are not exclusively about that at all. And they're often this search for control and all these other things. But in the way we treat them medically, all of that is completely excised, and there's sort of no social historical education in those treatment centers that could be incorporated in a way to make you feel like you're not alone and also make you feel less like it's your fault. I feel often the narrative is about de-centering thinness in your own mind and realizing how you've overvalued thinness yourself, rather than being we've all been locked in one room as women for a really long time, and we've been reading the room we've been locked into and finding ways to get thin enough to go between the bars and go explore society. So it's just sort of, I think, it was very important to me to make this book a very choral narrative so that it didn't fall into that kind of, here's how I did it. I got out and leave all my girls behind because they're so sick and they actually made me sicker. And instead sort of be I'm still sometimes in that room. Sometimes I'm out there, and also all of our stories have these hinge points where they inflect and refract off of each other and are not just a bunch of us soldiers on their own healing journeys, I guess.
And she sort of spoke there to the tension between the individuality and the group struggle. Is that something that you experienced?
Absolutely. I think there's this shared experience that many people have of like, what is an eating disorder supposed to look like? And I want to acknowledge that, for all the fault that I find in the medicalization of these illnesses, there's a lot of understandable reason behind why it's gotten to that point. I mean, you think about the damage that these illnesses can cause. They're second only to opioid use disorder in mortality among all of mental illnesses. I think we just consider how dangerous they can be. I mean, every 52 minutes in the US, somebody dies of an eating disorder. That's quite alarming. And so there's this kind of sensationalized content that emerges in the wake of that knowledge, understandably so, right? Trying to maybe deliver a bit of shock value to understand why it's so important that we talk about these things. And as an unfortunate side effect, people can really latch on to that romanticizing of the disorder, and a lot of memoirs end up, I think, falling in line with that. And a lot of these illnesses are very egocentric in nature, which is something I talked a little bit about with both of these women at the panel, meaning that there's something about it that feels like it gives a sense of self. There's something about it that maybe eases some degree of anxiety, or there's that's an experience that all of these women have, who are maybe I shouldn't say all, but a lot of people with eating disorders do experience that desire to have more of the eating disorder, to have more of it, and then maybe that will allow them to live the kind of life that their feelings of depression haven't allowed them to feel. There's like this magical thinking that comes along with it, and if we take kind of everyone who's experiencing that and put them all together, I think in many ways they're going to start feeding off of each other. And I definitely have seen that in treatment settings for sure.
How do you balance the need to prevent harm and prevent the use of those triggering words with addressing the systemic causes of eating disorders in treatment?
Well, I think there's two ways to look at this. There's the treatment of the individual and how we can, craft somebody's care to really look at the multifaceted pieces that have gone into the development of their eating disorder. I also think that there's a structural element that needs to shift in the ways that we even treat these illnesses. So much of the current gold standard of treatment comes from our kind of classic cognitive behavioral, dialectical behavioral therapies. And I see so much merit in that. I mean, we need to address a lot of the psychological pieces that go into the makeup of an eating disorder. And there's a lot of social experiences that end up getting neglected when we focus so much on these internal aspects of illness. One of the things that I know is increasingly common in treatment centers is to do more group outings, which of course, anytime there's a group of people with an eating disorder who are maybe going to a restaurant together, that's probably going to elicit a degree of anxiety, but nonetheless, it's kind of mimicking normative social experiences that we have. And I think any efforts to incorporate more of this awareness of all of these structural components into treatment really needs to get at some of those real life experiences that the eating disorder takes away or blurs in some way.
And so, Mary, I really wanted to get into the last question that you asked them, where you really make a very nice pivot between many of the dynamics that we've been talking about here and focusing a bit more on the future and recovery. And I wonder, why was that important to you?
Yeah, I think this question was really important to include, actually, from something that I mentioned earlier about the sense of rigidity and rule following and all of this quantitative stuff that gets superimposed on the experience of an eating disorder, and talk a little bit about how that could, inadvertently come up in the course of recovery. One of the things that's commonly stated about, especially women with eating disorders, is that they have a high degree of conscientiousness, of rule following behavior. And when we look at the way that can come about in recovery, it can accidentally be harmful. And so I was so curious to hear from both panelists about how they attempted to shed that mindset, because it can be so unique from person to person. And so I just wanted to ask you both if you could speak to the manner in which some of the rule following, the rigidity, these things that characterize the illness can also manifest in the treatment space. I know it certainly did for me. I'm curious to hear a little bit from you about how, you both speak about rules, food rules, internet rules, crossword rules, so many ways that rules come about. How does that permeate the space of recovery?
Well, really strangely, I started to see the crossword puzzle as so symptomatic that I was like, well, I'm in recovery now. I'm going to stop writing crossword puzzles, as if that was, but obviously follows a very similar rigidity of mind, right? Which is in some way led me into the disorder in the first place. One kind of framing that I had, or I kind of considered while writing this book was, the idea of thinking in terms of paradigms or thinking in terms of syntax. It's the way linguistics think often. Like he, she, her, it pronouns are paradigmatically related to each other because they could be substituted and the sentence would still make sense, right? She spoke, he spoke, they spoke. But that she and spoke are syntactically related. And so this idea of substitutions, obviously, like the crossword clue and the crossword word have to be perfect substitutions of each other. I think that's a lot of its pleasure is that as much indirection as there is, they're going to be perfect substitutes. It also spoke to the way that I was thinking about so many things, not just like, okay, recovery equals no puzzles, right? Like this rigidity of mind, but also the fact that I could allow myself to eat in some ways like calorically sufficient meal or day, but it had to be so rigidly determined. And if anything was substituted or changed, it was like temper tantrums and pain. And so for me, I've thought a lot about the process of recovery as an ongoing pursuit of syntactical relations, like trying to figure out to rediscover meaning in relation and not in substitution. So what's my relationship like to myself, to other women, to crossword puzzles, right? Like it doesn't have to be a substitutive, for lack of a better word.
I think that's really beautiful. I think I really relate to what you're saying about I think that feeling of I'm gonna have a temper tantrum, I'm gonna cry if something gets like slightly changed in the plan that I've been able to like finally do is because unfortunately in a lot of these treatment spaces, the kind of regimented and theatrical and surveillance elements of the eating disorder that you're enforcing on yourself before you go into treatment are reinforced in the center, but about eating instead of about restriction. So you're eating the 3 meals a day and the 3 snacks, but you're eating them like alongside everyone else in these very specific times of day. Everyone has slightly different ones, so you can sort of guess who's gaining weight faster. Yeah. And even though they're not, and you're gaining weight all the time, whether or not they let you see it or not, you're seeing people get kicked out every day because they gained enough weight that now their insurance is like, you're healed, whatever, all these things. And so they're not really giving you the tools to, in a non-rigid or theatrical or regimented way, eat an amount of food that is healthy for you in your daily life where anything might come up. And instead of it being like, I feel like there's not enough emphasis on like, instead of a day where I like eat in a way that is so nourishing and feels so good, what if I could just like literally not think about how I ate that day? And like, I focused on like my work and like I got a little ahead of me, so I couldn't go to like the specific lunch place I was gonna go to, and can go to the different one, and it doesn't have to be so regimented. And so I think for me, like recovery is this very ongoing process of just trying to unlearn a lot of rules, and also even outside of treatment spaces, just in the rhetoric we use to talk about recovery, I think that can sometimes be just as rigid in another way, like when people are trying to go so far in the other direction and do the like intuitive eating stuff, but then you're sort of like, I'm literally not even allowed to like, I mean, we don't need to get into that, but basically there can be like a policing of like over intense letting go of the rules, right? Which is again why I'm just like trying to stay in these like liminal spaces, because this has been the scaffolding of people's lives for so long. And so just going the complete opposite direction of being like, you should be able to just be fully recovered and free from food shame and free from like, and in touch with your appetite. All of that is like pretty unrealistic. And I think it's been for me about finding ways to speak honestly with people in my life and write about it honestly, so that I can like endure the painful thoughts that do still come up, and I think probably will throughout my life, about like my body and the way it's received by the world in relation to how I'm nourishing it, without resorting to the coping mechanism rule book that I do still have in my head, right? So it's about being able to not go back into that and find other ways to manage that discomfort, and not constantly like beat yourself up for needing those other ways. So yeah.
You know, it's so wonderful to hear the generosity and depth of experience that these individuals are sharing about their own experience. But I also want to remember that we were at the Brattleboro Literary Festival, and actually the panel began with a very beautiful reading from each of these authors, and I think we would like to sort of have the final segment of our podcast today be to hear the sort of beautiful prose, this wonderful creative work product that these two really remarkable individuals have wrought out of some very painful and complicated experiences in their lives.
First, we'll hear from Emmeline Clein, author of Dead Weight, Essays on Hunger and Harm. And then we'll hear from Anna Shechtman, author of The Riddles of the Sphinx, Inheriting the Feminist History of the Crossword Puzzle.
In the eating disorder memoirs, the girl recovers, but she often still wants us to know how close she got to the ultimate finish line. In so many of these stories, she blames her sisters for sending her there, teaching her their tricks and comparing limbs in high school hallways and then in hospital wards. The only way to survive seems to be renouncing your suffering sisters, transfiguring them into mean girl villains or naive, vain illness vectors. I'm trying to find out what might happen if we blame someone other than each other and ourselves for a change. In an exploration of her own anorexia diagnosis, the writer Rachel Aviv visits a therapist who treated her on an eating disorder ward in her childhood. She tells him she feels like she was taught the illness by other girls like her best friend from the hospital, whom she Googles, only to find her obituary and an article about her brief life, pockmarked by hospitalization after hospitalization. Once, between hospitalizations, that girl went to a party. I can imagine her angst, or I can feel it, and I wish I'd been there to say hi and ask how she was feeling. Uncomfortable and uncertain among the socializing strangers, she saw a girl she'd once been in eating disorder treatment with and made a beeline for her, hoping to reminisce about things that happened when they were institutionalized, but the girl was trying to escape. Her former patient peer shook her off. She was assimilating into the normal world, done with sick, starved girl world. The message was, you make me vulnerable. The contagion of identification, the terror of slipping into a story with a sad ending, the notion that porousness between people is potentially toxic rather than what makes life worth living. This scene is tragic because it is true and invented, because we were taught to believe it, but we don't have to be solo heroines on lonely journeys. We can also be sisters and friends, side characters in someone else's story without meeting her fate. We can maybe even be the person who changes it. Can I tell you a story that isn't mine? I'm going to be doing that a lot, but it's because I can't tell where you stop and I start, or I don't think it matters, not when we're locked on the same ward. Besides, so many of our stories are so similar, I slipped into yours in my dream last night, and you're welcome here whenever you want. Let me make you a drink and tell you about someone you might have been. The summer after 7th grade, I became a bat mitzvah girl and an oxymoron. According to the Torah, my bat mitzvah made me a woman, but in 2007, real adults were always asking me how it felt to be a bat mitzvah girl, leaving me wondering how I could be a woman while still a girl, on the cusp, peering over a cliff or stepping onto a stage. But that wasn't the only liminal label I received that year, and the biblical commandments weren't the only ones I was studying. The year I spent practicing my Torah portion was also the year I first oriented my life around losing weight, and the year I first heard a doctor say the words eating disorder, though he didn't say the words I'm ashamed to admit I desperately wanted to hear, anorexia nervosa. The words he chose instead were eating disorder not otherwise specified. This is the diagnosis you get if you have symptoms of anorexia or bulimia, but are subclinical or subthreshold, considered not symptomatic enough, or display symptoms of multiple disorders. Often, as in my case, these patients are simply suffering from anorexia's behavioral, cognitive, and emotional symptoms, but are not considered underweight enough to be deemed anorexic. I ended up in that doctor's office at the end of a year I'd spent struggling with food, a year in which I'd been bat mitzvahed, been ditched by my best friend, and joined Tumblr. I read the 10 Commandments, and then I read something called the Thin Commandments, and I believed back then, but I had doubts. Instead of investigating, I scrolled in the dark, repetitive motion, left hand on the keyboard and right hand moving from the cereal box to my mouth. I brought a religious intensity to my rituals. I reblogged, I chewed, I hearted, I swallowed. Judaism teaches that reading is devotion, study sacred. So I sought out an education in the only realm that ever felt spiritual to me, whisper circles and chat rooms. On the internet, girls taught me the commandments they lived by. I mouthed words and memorized, found the marked page in the Tanakh and practiced my Torah portion, and then night fell and I logged on. I studied the screen, the poems about eating disorders and the food logs and the quotes from starlets who died young and thin. Eating disorders and Judaism and girlhood, these mazes and matrices, spiritual planes on which you can be lost and found at the same time. The girls on Tumblr lived according to rules that involved food, but also feelings and a higher power. Things you can and can't eat and why. Judaism has rules like these too. Kashrut, a system of Byzantine bylaws bounding meals and words and prescriptions and guilt. My Torah portion was the story of the red heifer, a female cow used in a ritual purification ceremony. In order to be eligible to die to purify someone, she must be spotless, a single shade all over, and she must never have been pregnant, milked, or yoked. This is female purity. Smooth, sacrificial, untouched, hasn't worked a day in her life. When the same story is told in the Quran, Moses calls for a sacrificial red heifer, neither a calf nor immature, between two conditions. This too is part of purity. No longer a girl, not yet a woman, the perfect age to die sacrificially. I chanted the story in Hebrew, hungry. I was creating my own kashrut, a system of fasting and ritualistic rules cobbled together from magazines, diet books, blogs, eating disorder novels, and Google searches. I hadn't yet gotten my period or kissed anyone and wouldn't for years. No longer a girl, not yet a woman. Thank you.
So Emmeline writes so beautifully about the common ground you'll find sort of instantly with another person suffering from an eating disorder or in recovery. And I hope we talk quite a bit about that and the kind of sororal or rivalrous interactions that can develop out of that. But I'm going to read from a part of my book that's slightly different, anticipating that we'll get to some of that later. Okay. The evolution of the crossword puzzle is indebted to women who lived with a very clear sense of what it meant for them to be successful. They were wives, mothers, and homemakers. They have largely been forgotten, perhaps because the puzzle's inventor was a man. But, as we have seen, Mrs. M.B. Wood can claim the first crossword ever published under a byline in 1914. In 1924, Mrs. Helen Haven, the founding puzzle editor of the New York Herald Tribune, pioneered the crossword contest. And in 1934, Mrs. Elizabeth S. Kingsley invented the double cross-stick puzzle, or what we now know as an acrostic. These early innovators of the crossword form were followed by Bernice Gordon, who in 1965 was the first person to include a rebus in a crossword puzzle, in which more than one letter or a symbol occupies a single square of the grid, and Frances Hansen, who in 1968 began putting her own limericks in her puzzles. In her New York Times obituary in 2015, Gordon is said to have reinvented herself as an artist and crossword puzzle constructor after raising 3 children. After her death in 2004, Hansen was named a self-described housewife who marshaled imagination to make crossword puzzles. For these white, mostly college-educated women, the crossword puzzle was an intellectual outlet, providing escape from the relentless routines of childcare and then the doldrums of an empty nest. A housewife doesn't exactly have leisure time. She's never really off the clock, but she produces the comfortable conditions under which others can enjoy their off hours. Like knitting and quilting, the construction of a crossword puzzle may look like a leisure activity, but it is only another way of filling the home or the commuter train with pleasures for the worker in his downtime. The word housewife has only appeared twice in the New York Times crossword. In 1981, it was clued with deliberately misleading trivia. 9 letters for small container for sewing articles. See the portable housewife sewing kit, which derived its name in the 18th century from the women who used it, those who mended the clothes and knit together the fabric of domestic life. The puzzle that featured this archaic definition of housewife, skirting its obvious connotations in a post-feminine mystique world, was written by Sarah V. Tuckerman, who constructed dozens of puzzles for the Times. But the clue very likely came from the Times crossword editor in the 1980s, Eugene T. Maleska, who was infamous for his merciless rejection letters and who privileged knowledge, maybe even especially esoterica, over wordplay and timeliness, thus small container for sewing articles. In 1988, housewife appeared again in a Maleska-edited grid as part of a 3-entry theme. Try to visualize this if you can. 40 across, diary. 43 down, of a mag. 33 down, housewife. The 3 answers were collectively clued homemaker's memoirs, an almost impossibly flat translation of the theme entries, making no reference to the 1970 film Diary of a Mad Housewife that, along with Wanda, a woman under the influence, and an unmarried woman, divorced the image of the housewife from domestic bliss on a silver screen. Although this 1988 puzzle appeared under no byline, it was constructed by Jane S. Flowery. In a 2014 interview, she recounted, "I was a full-time homemaker and mother of toddlers in dire need of intellectual stimulation, so for my first effort, I chose a theme I could identify with." One wonders what her original clues were, untamed by Maleska's pen. What else besides many a crossword constructor, e.g., could stand in for housewife as a crossword puzzle clue? 9 letters for "You needn't be married to be one" on a hit Bravo franchise. Or Capital created it to service the male worker, per Silvia Federici. Or word from which hussy derives, paradoxically. Like so many constructors before me, I turn first to the dictionary when I write crossword clues. By the middle of the 16th century, the Oxford English Dictionary reports housewife, a typically married woman whose main occupation is managing the general running of a household, took on a sour second meaning, a frivolous, impertinent, or disreputable woman. By the 17th century, the meaning of the term depended on the pronunciation of its first syllable. Huswife, negative, housewife, positive. There's something at once uncanny and reassuring about seeing the history of a concept, in this case woman, embedded in the evolution of a word. It's linguistic proof of a truth universally unacknowledged, that the housewife and the hussy are one, cleaved from one another to discipline women with language, to establish the stark terms of a woman's success. Her reputation clung to a single vowel sound.
Thank you to Anna Shechtman and Emmeline Clein for sharing so much with us, their creativity, their personal stories, their insights into the way that the world works that maybe others aren't so tuned into.
And we want to thank Mary Iellamo for joining us on this special episode, sharing her expertise, and also for moderating that really eye-opening panel with those authors.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And a final thank you to the wonderful organizers of the Brattleboro Literary Festival who collaborated with us on this whole project, especially Sandra and Elizabeth, and also folks from BCTV locally in town who did the recording for the panel that we've used clips from today. Thank you again.
And we'll see you next episode.
Unravelling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat and is produced by Charts and Leisure.
Find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.